know the exact number, not in absolute terms, not a salary figure or a follower count or a square footage, but relative to someone specific. You hold these numbers the way a person holds a bruise. You know where it is without having to press it. You know at any given moment roughly where you stand in relation to the person you're measuring yourself against. And you know this is damaging you. You've known for years. You've told yourself to stop. You have not stopped. This is not because you lack self-awareness. You have an abundance of it. You are precisely aware of the comparison as it is happening. You can name the person you're measuring against, explain why you chose them, understand that the measurement is distorted and unfair and irrational and corrosive. The awareness does not interrupt the comparison. It just runs alongside it, a commentary track on a film that is going to play to the end regardless. There is a behavior at the center of this that most people have never named correctly. The comparison is not a symptom you're experiencing. It is a function you are performing. It is doing something for you that nothing else is doing, and this is why the awareness of its damage has never been sufficient to end it. You cannot stop doing something you need by simply deciding the cost is too high. The cost being too high is the easy part. The hard part is that you are using this comparison for a purpose that has never been named to you, and that purpose is not going away. The mechanism operating on you is not insecurity, or rather, insecurity is its surface manifestation, not its structure. What you are actually running is a borrowed measuring system, because at some point, for reasons that had nothing to do with your choices, you did not develop an internal standard for what constitutes a life worth living, a genuine, internally grounded account of what would make your particular existence feel like enough. And so, you borrowed one from outside. You borrowed the standard the culture offered, which is, compare yourself to the people near you, and your position in relation to them will tell you whether you are doing adequately. This borrowed system is not a sign of weakness. It is the default system. It is what everyone uses who hasn't replaced it with something else. And the reason you cannot stop comparing is not that the insecurity is too deep. It is that you have not replaced the system. The comparison is filling a structural vacancy. It is providing something that a genuine internal standard would provide: orientation, measurement, a sense of whether you are moving in a meaningful direction. And it will continue filling that vacancy until the vacancy is filled differently. That is what this script is actually about, not how to feel better about comparison. How to understand what it is structurally doing for you, so that you can see precisely what would have to change for it to stop being necessary. If this channel is giving you frameworks you haven't found elsewhere, subscribe. It's how this work reaches the people who need it. The borrowed measuring system, this comparison compulsion, that has been running beneath your conscious awareness of its damage, has a specific origin that most treatments of a comparison anxiety never locate correctly. Nietzsche's analysis of the herd is usually read as a political or cultural observation. His contempt for the mass of people who organize their values around what others think, who cannot evaluate anything except by reference to consensus, who experience excellence as a personal threat because it puts their own adequacy in question. Most people encounter this analysis and experience it as a description of other people. But Nietzsche's Jung was describing a psychological mechanism, not a class of individuals. And the mechanism runs in almost everyone, including the people who recognize it clearly in others and believe they have transcended it in themselves. The mechanism is this. In the absence of a self-generated value standard, the individual defaults to the comparative position. Not because they are weak, but because the comparative position is the only available measurement when no internal measurement exists. The person who genuinely knows what they are trying to do, who has a standard that emerged from inside rather than imported from the environment, does not need to compare in the compulsive way, because comparison tells them nothing relevant. Their standard is not calibrated to what others are doing. It is calibrated to something that other people's achievements cannot move. The person who compares compulsively does not have this standard, or they have fragments of it, genuine values they genuinely hold. But those fragments have not been built into a coherent account of what a life worth living looks like, specifically their life, irreducibly theirs. And so the comparison rushes in to fill the gap. It is not irrational. It is the rational behavior of a self that does not yet have a stable enough ground to stand on without taking measurements from the surrounding terrain. This is the thing you've never been told. Comparison is a measurement tool, and you cannot stop measuring by telling yourself the measurements are inaccurate. You stop measuring with this tool by acquiring a different one. Now bring in William James, and the picture becomes more specific and more uncomfortable. James described the self not as a fixed entity, but as a plurality, what he called the social self, the material self, the spiritual self. And his insight was that the social self is constitutively comparative. It is the self that exists in relation to other people's perceptions, and it evaluates itself primarily through the feedback it receives from its social environment. James was not describing a pathology. He was describing the basic architecture of human self-conception, which is inherently relational, which is built not from the inside out, but from the outside in, through accumulated social interaction, through what other people reflect back to us, through the position we occupy in every micro-hierarchy we inhabit. The social self is not a corruption of some purer, more authentic self. It is a fundamental layer of the self. Every person has it. The question is not whether you have a social self that compares. You do, inevitably, as a consequence of being a social animal. But whether you have developed something beyond it that can provide orientation when the social comparisons become corrosive. James called this the spiritual self, not in the religious sense, but in the sense of the deepest layer of self-consciousness, the evaluating subject that is aware of both the social self and the material self and can stand in some relation to them. The spiritual self, in James's frame, is the self that asks what is worth doing rather than what is currently being rewarded. It is the self that can be out of step with the social environment without therefore being lost, because its coordinate system is not the environment. Most people have an underdeveloped spiritual self, not because they haven't thought about meaning, they've thought about it constantly. But thinking about meaning and building an actual internal standard are not the same activity. One is reflection. The other is the sustained, costly commitment to a particular answer about what your life is for. An answer you are willing to hold even when the social environment is pointing in a different direction, even when the people around you are achieving things that make your own position look, by comparison, inadequate. You think the comparison is the problem. The underdeveloped internal standard is the problem. The comparison is what the absence of that standard looks like from the inside. Apply this somewhere unexpected to the person who is genuinely successful by most available measures, who has achieved more than most people they know, who has by any objective standard done well, and who cannot stop comparing upward, who finds that every achievement generates a brief relief and then a new measurement against the next tier, who suspected that reaching this level would quiet the comparison and has discovered that it has not. This person believes their comparison problem is about insecurity. It may be, in part, but the structural reason the comparison doesn't stop when the achievements accumulate is not that the self-esteem hasn't caught up yet. It is that the measurement system being used is inherently relative, and a relative system has no stable, satisfying endpoint. The comparison will escalate as the achievements escalate. The ceiling moves. The person who is using the comparative position as their primary measurement instrument discovers that more achievement does not produce more ground to stand on. It produces more terrain to measure. The problem is not the speed of the escalation. The problem is the architecture. Fromm saw this clearly, though from a different angle. Fromm's description of the marketing character, the person who has come to experience themselves primarily as a commodity to be sold, whose sense of value is constitutively dependent on how they are evaluated by others, is not a description of the insecure or the shallow. It is a description of what happens to a person whose interior life has been colonized by the logic of the market, which is inherently comparative, inherently ranked, inherently structured around the question of what is currently in demand relative to what else is available. The marketing character does not experience this as external pressure. They experience it as themselves. The constant monitoring of their position, relative to peers, relative to competitors, relative to cultural ideals, feels like self-awareness. It feels like ambition. It feels like the responsible concern of a person who takes their life seriously. What it actually is, in Fromm's analysis, is the replacement of genuine inner life with the continuous performance of positioning. The person has become so thoroughly oriented toward the external standard that the question of what they would value if the external standard didn't exist has become genuinely difficult to answer. And here is the part of Fromm's analysis that is almost never quoted. The marketing character is not unhappy in the ordinary sense. They are not suffering in a way that is immediately legible as suffering. They are busy. They are engaged. They are responsive to every shift in the social environment in a way that looks, from the outside, like adaptability and social intelligence. What is not visible is the specific absence at the center, the absence of what Fromm called the productive orientation, the character that generates its values from inside rather than receiving them from the social environment and returning them amplified. The productive character for Fromm is not a character that produces in the economic sense. It is the character that is the source of its own standards, that does not need the comparative position to feel oriented because it is oriented by something that lives inside the evaluation process rather than in its results. This is the most uncomfortable version of the comparison problem. Not that you compare because you feel inadequate, but that you have been comparing for so long, so consistently, as the primary means of generating a sense of your own value, that the question of what you would want independently of comparison has become genuinely obscure, not suppressed, obscured. The wanting is still there. It simply has not been cultivated the way the comparative evaluation has been cultivated, and so it is quieter and less legible and less readily available when you reach for it. Jung's concept of individuation is relevant here not as a solution, but as a description of what would have to happen for the comparison compulsion to lose its hold. Individuation, in Jung's frame, is the process by which a person progressively separates from the collective, not in the sense of rejection or superiority, but in the sense of developing enough of a genuinely personal relationship with one's own nature that the collective standards become less organizing. The individuated person is not immune to social comparison. They simply have enough of their own ground that the comparison is not structurally necessary in the way it was before. The persona, the social mask, the interface between the private self and the public world is constitutively comparative. The persona is built to function in a particular social environment, which means it is built in response to what that environment rewards, which means it is built through comparison. This is not pathological. The persona is necessary. The problem occurs when the persona becomes the only self the person has access to, when the private self has been so thoroughly shaped by the demands of the social environment that the inner life is less a private reality and more a backstage version of the public performance. The person in this condition does not experience themselves as performing. They experience themselves as being. But their sense of who they are is constructed almost entirely from the outside in, from the feedback they receive, the positions they occupy, the comparisons that locate them in the social field. And this self, built from the outside in, has no stable ground that is independent of the comparative position. Every shift in the social environment produces a corresponding shift in the self. Every comparison that goes badly produces a genuine destabilization, not because the person is fragile, but because the comparison is structurally constitutive of who they take themselves to be. Individuation, then, is not the acquisition of self-esteem. It is the development of a self that has enough interior reality to be something other than responsive to the social environment's evaluation. This is why positive affirmations and gratitude practices do not touch the comparison compulsion. They address the content of the self-evaluation without addressing the architecture of the evaluating self. But individuation is not a project you complete. It is a process that requires sustained engagement with the question of who you actually are beneath the social performance, beneath the accumulated roles, beneath the persona that was built to function adequately in the environments you have inhabited. Most people never engage with this question long enough or seriously enough to develop the internal standard that would make the external comparison less necessary. Not because they are incapable of it, because the question is genuinely difficult and the comparison is readily available. And the comparison provides a kind of answer, provisional, relative, insufficient but immediate, that the genuine internal standard does not provide quickly or easily. Dostoevsky saw a specific variant of this that is worth naming precisely. The underground man, that figure of paralytic self-consciousness, compares incessantly. And he knows he compares incessantly, and the knowledge does not stop the comparison. What Dostoevsky shows in the opening monologue of the notes is the specific structure of the self that is trapped in comparison. It is a self that is intensely aware of other people's perceptions and constitutively unable to ignore them, not because it is weak, but because its entire sense of its own reality is generated through the contrast with others. The underground man needs the officers to look down on him. Without the comparison, even the bad comparison, there is no orientation. The comparison even when it is humiliating, is providing something that the absence of comparison does not provide. This is the part that is hardest to see in yourself. The comparison that makes you feel worst is sometimes also the comparison that makes you feel most real. The person you measure yourself against, upward or downward, is providing you with a coordinate system. And coordinate systems are hard to give up even when they are painful, because without them you are not navigating badly. You are not navigating at all. The comparison is easier. The comparison is always there. And this is precisely the problem. The easier path is available at every moment, and the more effortful path, the one that would actually close the structural vacancy, requires a kind of sustained discomfort that the comparison relieves before it can do its work. Now here is the complication that makes this genuinely hard. You cannot develop an internal standard by deciding to have one. This is the failure mode of every therapeutic or self-help approach to comparison. It tells you to stop comparing, to practice gratitude, to focus on your own path, to remember that everyone's timeline is different. These instructions are correct. They are also useless for the actual problem, which is not a deficit of intention, but a deficit of formation. The internal standard is not a perspective you adopt. It is something that develops through a specific kind of engagement with your own experience over time, through the sustained confrontation with questions about what you actually value when the social reward is removed, through the experience of choosing something that cost you socially because you believed in it, through the accumulation of choices that were made from the inside rather than from the comparative position. The internal standard is built through the process of living as if you had one before you do. Nietzsche called this the will to power, and it is almost always misread as a will to dominate. What Nietzsche meant was something more specific and more interior, the will to become what you actually are, to develop and express your own genuine capacities rather than the capacities that the environment rewards. The will to power in this reading is the force that drives individuation, the drive toward a form of excellence that is defined by one's own nature rather than by comparison with others. The person in whom this force is active and developed does not compare compulsively because their reference point is not other people. It is the gap between who they currently are and who they are capable of being, a gap that is internally measurable, that exists independently of what anyone else is doing, and that provides orientation regardless of where they stand in any social hierarchy. This is what Nietzsche called the higher type, not a type of person who is born superior, but a type of relationship with one's own development. The higher type measures progress against their own previous self. This is not an easy or comfortable standard. In some ways, it is more demanding than the comparative standard, because there is no one else's failure to take comfort in, no downward comparison available that relieves the pressure. The only measurement is between what you are and what your own nature calls you toward. But it is stable. It does not move when other people move. It does not escalate when others achieve. It is calibrated to something that the social environment cannot alter. Most people do not experience this drive as clearly distinct from the comparative drive, because both involve evaluating oneself and feeling that one is insufficient. But the comparative drive measures against others. The internal drive measures against oneself. And the difference over time is the difference between a life that is perpetually destabilized by what other people are doing and a life that is not. Not because the other people's achievements have stopped being real, but because the measurement that matters is no longer responsive to them. Frankl, writing from a context in which all external comparison was rendered meaningless, observed that the people who maintained the most intact inner life under extreme conditions were those who had a relationship with their own meaning that was not constituted by the social environment. They could not compare upward or downward in any way that the camps would recognize. What they had instead was a relationship with their own values and purposes that continued to function in the absence of all the social infrastructure that normally makes comparison possible. Frankl was not describing people who were immune to suffering or to the knowledge of how others were faring. He was describing people who had, at some prior point in their lives, often without recognizing that this was what they were building, developed enough internal ground that when the external environment was stripped of all comparative meaning, there was still something left, something that the comparison had not constituted and therefore could not take away when it disappeared. The specific word Frankl used for the thing that remained was meaning, and he was precise about its source. Meaning, in his frame, is not found in outcomes or in the comparison of one's position to others. It is found in the orientation of the self towards something it has chosen to care about. The person who has chosen, genuinely, not aspirationally, what they care about independently of what caring about it will do for their social position, has something the comparative environment cannot threaten. Not because they are stronger, because they are measuring with a different instrument. Most people in ordinary life never develop this precisely because ordinary life never requires it. The comparison is always available. The social environment is always there, reflecting back a position, and the position provides enough orientation that the deeper question, what would provide orientation if all of that were gone, never becomes pressing. Until the comparison becomes genuinely unbearable, until the upward comparison generates enough suffering that staying in the borrowed system becomes more costly than the difficulty of building something else. This is not an action item. This is a recognition. The comparison compulsion ends not when you develop better coping strategies for comparison, not when your self-esteem improves, not when you practice gratitude sufficiently, but when the internal standard becomes real and developed enough to provide what the comparison has been providing: orientation, measurement, a sense of whether you are moving towards something that genuinely matters. That development is slow. It requires asking repeatedly and without rushing toward an answer what you would actually pursue if the social reward were removed. It requires noticing the moments when you are moving from genuine internal motivation rather than from the comparative drive. And the two feel different, though most people have not spent enough time with the internal version to recognize it reliably. It requires the experience of choosing something that costs you socially because you believed in it independently of what it would look like. And it requires tolerating the specific discomfort of not yet having the internal standard fully formed, of being in the period between having recognized the borrowed system and having built a genuine one, when the comparison is still running, still providing a kind of orientation, even though you can now see exactly what it is. You are probably in that period now. The comparison has not ended. You can see what it is. You can see what it has been doing. What you cannot yet do, and this is the thing to be honest about, is stop, because the structural vacancy it has been filling is not yet filled. Seeing the borrowed scale clearly is not the same as having put it down. You will continue using it probably in the moments when the internal standard is not yet developed enough to provide what the comparison provides. That is not failure. That is the accurate description of where you are. What changes is not the comparison itself, not yet. What changes first is the relationship to it, the recognition that when the comparison arrives, it is arriving because something structural is asking for orientation, and that the comparison is the only available instrument, and that the instrument is wrong for the measurement, but present and ready and familiar. You can use it and know what you are using. That is a different position than using it while believing it is telling you the truth. The borrowed scale is not yours, but you have been using it long enough that it feels like it is.